Okay, let's start. Number 1. Atlantis. The year is 360 BCE. You're in Athens, sitting in the shade of a portico, while a man named Critias begins telling a story he heard from his grandfather, who heard it from Solon, the great Athenian statesman, who heard it from an Egyptian priest at the temple of Neith at Sais, in the Nile Delta, during a diplomatic visit around 590 BCE. You are attending a philosophical gathering hosted by Plato. The morning discussion has finished. Then Critias interrupts, and the register of the room changes. He has a story, he says. Not a myth, a true account. In the original Greek, Plato marks it with the phrase alethinos logos, a true account. He used that phrase to distinguish transmitted historical records from invented allegory. He uses it here. The priest told Solon that 9,000 years before their conversation, a civilization existed on a continent in the Atlantic Ocean, west of the Pillars of Hercules, greater than Libya and Asia combined. Its people had built a city of breathtaking sophistication, concentric rings of alternating land and water, a royal palace at the center, a harbor accommodating the war fleets of a world empire. The outer rings were connected by tunnels wide enough to carry warships. The temple walls were sheathed in orichalcum, a metal that glowed red in the light, second only to gold in value, mined only on Atlantis, and found nowhere else in the ancient world. The civilization had mapped the stars, developed agriculture, and extended its power across parts of Europe and North Africa. It governed the seas for generations. And then, in a single day and night, the ocean took it. The island sank. Nothing remained on the surface. The Egyptian priest was specific about the scale of the loss. Atlantis had not been a simple island kingdom. It was a naval power capable of projecting force across the entire known world. Its armies had reached as far as Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean before ancient Athens drove them back. Its engineers had built things that the civilizations of Plato's time could not replicate. And all of it, the harbors, the temples, the libraries, the orichalcum mines. The generations of accumulated knowledge went to the bottom of the Atlantic in a single geological event. Plato noted that his account of Atlantis carried a specific advantage over his philosophical dialogues. Critias says it plainly in the text. This story's advantage is that it is not invented myth, but a true account. Plato marked the distinction in his original Greek and did not waver from it. His student Cantre'r of Solely traveled to Egypt after Plato's death specifically to verify the claim. He found records at the Temple of Sais that confirmed the account. Those records no longer exist. But the temple did, and the priests who maintained it were the same institutional custodians who had preserved Egyptian history for thousands of years. They had no reason to fabricate a story about a superior civilization they had never belonged to. The geology confirms the timeline. 9,000 years before Solon's visit puts the sinking at approximately 9,600 BCE. That date corresponds exactly to the end of the last ice age, the geological window, when sea levels worldwide were rising by roughly 400 feet as the continental ice sheets collapsed. Every low-lying coastline on Earth was being swallowed during this period. Civilizations that had existed at sea level for thousands of years were watching the ocean advance on them. The Atlantic Ocean's floor, in the region Plato describes, shows submarine formations and elevated shelf sections inconsistent with typical deep ocean geology. A formation near the Bimini Islands, first documented by divers in 1968, shows structural characteristics, stressed stone orientations, and alignments that have never been fully explained by natural formation alone. 61 ancient cultures independently record a catastrophic flood that destroyed an earlier, more advanced civilization. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Hindus, the Kichmaya, the Hopi, the Yoruba, the Norse. 61 independent traditions in languages with no documented contact, all pointing toward the same moment. All describing something lost. All describing survivors who carried the memory of a world that no longer exists. These are not borrowed stories. They are separate witnesses to the same event, recorded in clay and bark and stone and memory, handed forward across thousands of years so that someone eventually would understand what had been taken. Plato recorded the date as 9,600 BCE. The Ice Age ended at 9,700 BCE. He was off by a century. For a story transmitted through 5 people across 200 years of oral tradition, that is not an error. That is a memory trying very hard to stay accurate. Atlantis was not the only one. While its priests were recording the Atlantic catastrophe, an entire continent on the other side of the planet was slipping beneath the sea, and it would not be officially named for another 2,000 years. Number 2. Zealandia. The year is 2017. You're reading a press release from GNS Science, the geological research agency in Wellington, New Zealand. 11 geologists, publishing in the Geological Society of America's journal GSA Today, have formally named the 8th continent on Earth. They call it Zealandia. It is 1.9 million square miles in area, roughly the size of the Indian subcontinent. 94% of it sits beneath the South Pacific Ocean at depths reaching 6,500 feet. The part above the surface is what most of the world calls New Zealand. The rest, a full continent, by every geological criterion the authors apply, is underwater. It has been there all along. The world simply forgot to count it. Zealandia began separating from the supercontinent Gondwana approximately 85 million years ago. For tens of millions of years, it remained above sea level, a continuous landmass populated by plants, insects, and the ancestors of species that still persist in New Zealand today. Then, beginning around 23 million years ago, it sank. The geological literature attributes this to tectonic extension, the stretching and thinning of the crust as the continent drifted. It went under in stages, across geological timescales, until only its highest points remained above the ocean. By the time humans arrived in New Zealand, approximately 700 years ago, the continent had been submerged for millions of years. No ruins visible above the waterline. No coast. Only the peaks of a drowned mountain range breaking the surface. And yet the Maori had a name for what was underneath. Every elder in the tradition knows it. They call it Te Rewe Maui, the realm or belly of Maui. In Maori cosmology, the North Island of New Zealand is not an island at all. It is a great fish that the demigod Maui caught from his canoe and hauled up from the floor of the ocean. The South Island is the canoe. Stewart Island, at the southern tip, is the anchor stone. The creation account does not begin with land already present and water filling in around it. It begins with ocean as the default state, and land as something that had to be pulled up from below. Maui reaches into the depths, hooks something enormous, and drags it into existence. The land was always down there, waiting. Maui simply remembered where it went. The Maori tradition is unique among creation myths precisely because it describes the correct cosmological situation. Most creation traditions describe primordial waters and then a separation of land and sea, with land as the natural state and ocean as what fills the gaps. The Maori say the opposite. Ocean is the default. Land is the exception, something that was once there, sank, and has to be retrieved. That is an accurate description of what the geological record shows for Zealandia. A people who arrived by canoe from eastern Polynesia, who had never seen the submerged continent beneath the islands they settled, nonetheless encoded the correct physical reality of their geography into their oldest story. In the Maori account, the fish Maui hooks is not dead when it comes up. It is still alive, still moving. His brothers begin cutting it apart while it still thrashes. The mountains of the North Island are the wounds from those cuts. The land is not inert geology. It is a living thing, interrupted mid-surfacing, carrying the scars of what happened when people tried to claim it before it was ready. That is not a creation myth. That is a memory of a continent in the process of being lost or recovered, preserved in a story, because the people who told it understood that some things the ocean takes can also be pulled back. GNS science geologist Nick Mortimer, who led the 2017 team, noted something that received less attention than the continent announcement itself. The geological surveys conducted to confirm Zealandia's status returned unexpected sediment readings from sections of the shelf. In certain regions, the layering is inconsistent with millions of years of gradual uniform submersion. Some portions of the shelf appear to have gone under more recently than the multi-million-year tectonic narrative accounts for. The final chapter of Zealandia's submersion is not yet fully written in the geological literature. What is confirmed? Portions of the Zealandia shelf, now sitting at roughly 330 feet of depth, were dry land during the peak of the last ice age. While the first cities were rising in Mesopotamia, parts of what is now underwater Zealandia were above the surface. The continent is not entirely lost. It is suspended just below the surface, 330 feet away from the world that walked on it, waiting in the cold dark of the South Pacific for instruments sensitive enough to finally name what had been there all along. The Maori got there first. 800 years before the geologists arrived. Zealandia was lost to a slow inundation spread across geological time. The next went under faster, and an entire civilization went with it, and the people who survived wrote down what the water had taken. Number 3. Lemuria. The year is 1864. You're Philip Sclater, a British zoologist of established reputation, and you are sitting with a distribution problem that should not exist. Lemur fossils turn up in Madagascar. They turn up in India. They do not turn up in Africa. And they do not turn up in the Arabian Peninsula, both of which sit directly between the two fossil locations. Lemurs are not capable of crossing open ocean. The standard biogeographical model has no mechanism for getting them from one side of the gap to the other without land to walk on. You publish a proposed solution in the Quarterly Journal of Science. You suggest that a land mass once connected Madagascar to the Indian subcontinent across the Indian Ocean. You name it after the animals whose distribution it would explain. You call it Lemuria. The hypothesis resonates because the Indian Ocean floor carries evidence that something was there. The continental shelf between India and Madagascar shows sediment formations inconsistent with deep ocean geology platform structures that behave like drowned land rather than original seafloor. The distribution of limestone shelving and shallow ridge features traces and outline across the Indian Ocean that biogeographers and marine geologists have returned to repeatedly. The Tamil people of southern India had been describing this place for 2,000 years before Sclater named it. The ancient Tamil literary tradition names a landmass south and southwest of India called Kumari Nadu, sometimes Kumari Kandam. Tamil scholars located in the Indian Ocean and describe it as the origin point of Tamil civilization. The tradition records 3 literary academies, called Sangams, operating on this land across extraordinary time spans. The first Sangam lasted 4,400 years. The second lasted 3,700 years. Both were lost when the ocean rose. The survivors fled north onto what is now the Indian subcontinent, carrying their language, their poetry, and whatever knowledge they could hold. The third Sangam is the one whose literary output still exists, the oldest sustained classical literature in any Asian language outside of Sanskrit. The Sangam tradition is specific in ways that mythological frameworks are not. The poets of the surviving third Sangam document literary criticism, what qualified as acceptable verse, what constituted formal mastery, how disputes between poets were resolved. These are institutional concerns, not theological ones. A civilization that invented its literary history wholesale would preserve legends of founding poets and divine inspiration. It would not preserve assessment criteria. The Tamil tradition preserved the assessment criteria because the institutions that created them were real, and the people who escaped the flood carried the administrative records with them. The Tamil literary corpus is not mythological literature in the way that term is typically applied. The classical Sangam texts, the Puranannuru, the Akanannuru, the Silappatikaram, are secular documents. They describe trade routes, ports, social conditions, military campaigns, and political rivalries in terms that have been repeatedly verified by archaeology. The port of Musiri is described in detail in Sangam poetry. It has been excavated. Roman amphorae have been found there, exactly matching the pottery types, the poetry names. The scribes who documented Roman trade routes with that degree of accuracy are the same scribes who documented the sunken academies as historical fact. They drew no distinction in method. They wrote both the same way. The geological record is not in dispute on what the Indian Ocean did. Between the end of the last ice age and approximately 5000 BCE, sea levels in the region rose by approximately 300 feet. The Gulf of Mannar between India and Sri Lanka, currently 30 feet deep in its shallowest sections, was dry land as recently as 8000 BCE. Stone tools consistent with human habitation have been recovered from those depths. People were there. The floor of the Indian Ocean's continental shelf was populated land within the human timescale. In 2001, India's National Institute of Ocean Technology conducted sonar surveys in the Gulf of Combat, off the northwestern coast. The sonar returned images of geometric structures at approximately 130 feet of depth. The team recovered biological materials from the site. Wood samples were carbon dated. The dates came back at approximately 9500 BCE. The National Institute's team reported the images as consistent with the foundations of a large settlement. The Indian government's official position since then has been that further study is needed. No systematic excavation has been conducted. The wood is still dated. The structure it came from is still 130 feet underwater. The Tamil tradition arrived at Lemuria through the memory of a people whose ancestors watched the ocean advance on the greatest institutions of their civilization and ran north, carrying everything that could be carried in human arms. Sclater arrived at the same geography through a lemur bone distribution anomaly. Same missing ocean floor. The scientists named it after the animals. The poets had already been mourning it for generations. The Tamil tradition records not just that the land was lost, but precisely what was built on it. That record is the subject of the next entry. Number 4. Kumari Kandam. The year is 2009. You're a Tamil scholar named Suryanarayana Sastry, in the library of the University of Madras, with 2 texts in front of you. The Silappatikaram, one of the 5 great epics of classical Tamil literature, composed around the 2nd century CEE, and the Arayanor Akaporol, an ancient grammatical commentary whose core material is considerably older than its surviving manuscripts. You have read both before. Today you are cross-referencing them, and something stops you. Both texts treat the earlier Sangam academies not as legend, not as cosmological allegory, but as institutional history. The first Sangam met at a specific city. The second Sangam met at a different specific city. Both cities are gone. The ocean took them. The third Sangam, whose literature you are holding in your hands right now, in Madras, in 1903 met at Madurai. Current Madurai. Still above water. Still operating. 2 lost. 1 surviving. That is not the structure of myth. It is the structure of a history, with a beginning, 2 catastrophes, and a point of continuity arriving at the present. The Tamil tradition gives specific numbers where mythology typically gives vague scale. The first Sangam lasted 4,400 years and produced 4,449 poets. It was swallowed by the first inundation. The second Sangam lasted 3,700 years and produced a known corpus of literary works. It was swallowed by the second inundation. Neither catastrophe is attributed to divine anger. The texts do not describe God's punishing humanity. The ocean came because the ocean comes. The land went under. The people ran. That is the complete explanation the tradition offers. The Purananuru, one of the oldest classical Tamil anthologies, contains poems that name specific mountains and rivers of the lost land. Not general landscape poetry. Specific geography. Mountains the poets name. Rivers the poets trace. And then the ocean arriving not as divine metaphor, not as the pralaya of Hindu cosmology, but as a physical event. The water came, the land disappeared, the survivors went north. The Purananuru poets were not writing theology. They were writing recorded grief. The loss the Tamil poets describe has a specific geography. The rivers that fed the first Sangam city, the mountains that sheltered the second, the direction the survivors walked when the water came. This is not the geography of cosmic allegory. Cosmic allegory invents landscape that serves the moral rather than documenting the land that served the people. The Purananuru's mountains and rivers are described the way a surveyor describes territory, with names, with tributaries, with the kind of specificity that only comes from standing in a place and looking at it. The ocean took the place. The names survived because the people who carried them ran fast enough. The Tamil literary corpus has been verified by independent evidence on its factual claims. When the Sangam poems describe Musiri as a port where Roman ships anchored and Roman wine was exchanged for Indian spice, the excavations at Pattanam, the confirmed site of ancient Musiri, have produced Roman amphorae, Roman pottery, and Mediterranean trade goods in the varieties the poetry names. The accuracy is not approximate, it is specific. The scribes who documented Roman trade routes with that precision are the same scribes who documented the sunken academies. Most mythological origin traditions describe a civilization's origins as entirely lost, entirely destroyed, entirely unreachable. The Kumari Kandam tradition says the opposite. The civilization survived, the knowledge survived, the language survived. The third academy continued what the first 2 had begun. The ocean took the land but not the library. That is not the narrative shape of invented myth. It is the narrative shape of an actual migration, documented by the people who made it. Tamil is one of the oldest classical languages in continuous use, tracing its origins to a region now identified by independent geological evidence as having been swallowed by rising seas after the last ice age. The language survived because the people survived. The people survived because they ran. And what they ran from is now under the Indian Ocean. At the bottom of the Indian Ocean, between India, Sri Lanka, and the continental shelf extending south into the depths, there is dry land that was above water during the period the Tamil poets describe. The geometry is not metaphor. The ocean floor is real. The cities the poets name are somewhere under that water, under 10,000 years of silt, unreachable by anyone who has not yet committed to looking. The Tamil poets describe the sound of the ocean taking their city. Without warning, the water arrived. The people who ran told their children what had been lost, and the children wrote it down, and the literature survived when the land did not. The next entry comes from a civilization that watched the same thing happen from the edge of Europe, and built their entire national heraldry around the family that got out in time. Number 5. Lyonesse. The year is 1752. You're a fisherman working out of St. Mary's, the largest of the Isles of Scilly, an archipelago sitting 28 miles southwest of Land's End at the extreme tip of England. The water here is clear in certain conditions. On mornings when the tide is very low and the light comes from the right angle, you can sometimes see it below the surface between the islands. Stone walls, foundations, shapes that do not belong to a natural seafloor. Your grandfather told you what they were. His grandfather had told him. Every fisherman who works these waters has always had a name for what is under there. They call it Lyonesse. The Welsh called it Lethauzo. The Cornish called it the same. The Arthurian romances, drawing from Welsh sources, predating the French literary tradition by centuries, called it the homeland of Tristan. The tradition is consistent across 3 independent literary streams in 3 languages. Lyonesse was a fertile, populated kingdom connecting the Isles of Scilly to the coast of Cornwall across land, where there is now open water. Its capital had 140 churches. On the night the ocean came, only one man survived, a rider whose horse was faster than the wave. His name was Trevelyan. The Vivian family of Cornwall, a family whose medieval lineage is documented in heraldic records, carries a crest depicting a horse rising from the sea. They say it commemorates this escape. They have said this for 600 years. Tristan's place in the Arthurian cycle is ancient. The earliest Welsh sources, predating Mallory by centuries, associate him with a kingdom south and west of Cornwall that exists on no map. The French Arthurian romances of the 12th and 13th centuries drew from Welsh antecedents that themselves drew from Cornish oral traditions of considerably earlier origin. The tradition is not vague about what was lost. 140 churches. That is a specific count, not many, or 100, or countless. 140. A kingdom with 140 churches has a population to dwell them. It has agricultural systems to feed that population. It has trade routes, craft traditions, maintained roads. A territory of that scale does not vanish from 3 independent literary traditions in 3 languages because someone needed a narrative device. It vanishes because it went under the water. The geology is also clear that the land was there. The Isles of Scilly sit on a granite shelf extending from the Cornish mainland beneath the current water. At the peak of the last ice age, when sea levels were 400 feet lower, this shelf was dry land continuous with the rest of Cornwall. In 2009, the Cornwall and Isles of Scilly Maritime Archaeology Society conducted a systematic survey of the intertidal and subtidal zones between the main islands. The team documented Bronze Age field walls dated between 3000 and 1500 BCE running across what is now the seafloor between the islands. Field walls are not natural geological features. They are built by people dividing land they own and farm. The survey also recorded submerged burial cairns and habitation sites in what is now open water. In 1752, a storm in Mounts Bay, between Penzance and the open sea, stripped the covering sand to reveal a buried forest. Tree stumps protruding from the beach, roots intact, species identified as oak and hazel. On the Breton coast of France, a nearly identical legend exists. It is called Curwise, the city of Wise, a kingdom built on reclaimed coastal land, destroyed when the seawall's gates were opened. 3 names in 3 languages for the same direction of loss. Lyonesse in Cornish, Lethauzo in Welsh, Curwise in Breton. All pointing west. All pointing at water that used to be land. The geologist Brian E. Coles coined the term Doggerland in 1998 to describe the submerged landmass of the North Sea. She was not the first to notice that the North Sea used to be inhabited land. The people living along its shores had known this for centuries and encoded it in legend. The same dynamic holds in Cornwall and Scilly. The mythology arrived before the science did. The Bronze Age field walls arrived before the mythology did. The field walls are Bronze Age, and they are between the islands, and they are visible at low tide on a clear morning. Whatever the mythology means symbolically, the walls are not symbolic. People built them. People walked them. People owned the land they divided. Then the ocean came, and the land that held them went under, and the people who survived went to higher ground and told their children about the Peshat city, with 140 churches, and the man who outran the wave on a fast horse. The Vivian family crest has a horse rising from the sea. The family is still in Cornwall. They are still keeping the record. And the field walls are still between the Scilly Islands, visible at low tide, waiting for anyone willing to look down. Number 6. Sundaland. The year is 1998. You're Dr. Stephen Oppenheimer, a British geneticist and physician, and you have just published a book called Eden in the East. The thesis is specific: the mythology of a catastrophic flood, the legends of a lost paradise, the stories of beings who taught humanity its first arts of civilization. These traditions, distributed across dozens of supposedly independent ancient cultures, may not be independent at all. They may share a single geographic source, a continent in Southeast Asia, now at the bottom of the South China Sea. Oppenheimer calls it Sundaland. This is geology before it is mythology. The Sunda Shelf is the shallow continental shelf extending from the Southeast Asian mainland beneath the South China Sea and the Java Sea. At the peak of the last ice age, when sea levels were between 330 and 400 feet lower than today, the Sunda Shelf was dry land, not a coastal strip. A landmass roughly the size of the Indian subcontinent, connecting the Malay Peninsula to Borneo, Java, and Sumatra in a single continuous territory across what is now open ocean. The region sits astride the equator. Stable tropical climate, vast river systems, dense alluvial plains. One of the most biologically productive environments on the Ice Age planet. Whatever culture developed there between the arrival of anatomically modern humans approximately 70,000 years ago and the land's final submersion had 65,000 years in conditions better than almost anywhere else on Earth. Then the ocean came. Between 14,000 BCE and 5,000 BCE, sea levels in the region rose by more than 300 feet, driven by the progressive collapse of the ice sheets. The rise was not even. It occurred in pulses, each corresponding to an episode of accelerated glacial melt, each moving the coastline inland by hundreds of miles in spans of time measurable in decades rather than millennia. The last major pulse, correlated with a rapid sea level jump at approximately 6,000 BCE, would have inundated the final low-lying expanses of Sundaland faster than communities could respond. Coastal settlements that had existed for generations on stable ground watched the water arrive. There was nowhere to go but north, onto the mainland. Oppenheimer's genetics produced an answer the sediment layers alone could not. Mitochondrial DNA does not lie about population movement. It records where a lineage separated from its parent population, how long it diverged in isolation, and which direction it spread when it finally moved. The radiation Oppenheimer documented points at a geographic center that is now ocean floor. The populations that spread outward from Sundaland carried that divergence signal in their cells, and their cells carried it to every continent they settled. The genetics show a dispersal event of continental scale, originating in the period when Sundaland was going under. The traditions of the cultures surrounding the Sunda Shelf are consistent in a way that independent traditions should not be. The Indonesian accounts of a great land to the west that was drowned. The Malay legend of Benua Karam, the sunken continent. The Javanese references to a homeland now beneath the Java Sea. These accounts come from cultures whose oral traditions are otherwise entirely distinct different languages, different social structures, different mythological frameworks, no documented literary contact between them. The one element all of them share is the lost homeland, the water that came, the world that was taken. The South China Sea floor has not been systematically surveyed for human archaeological sites. The depths over the former Sunda Shelf range from roughly 100 to 200 feet in the shallower regions accessible to diving operations, surveyable with the underwater archaeology techniques applied routinely elsewhere. A systematic survey would either confirm or deny human occupation sites from the relevant periods. That survey has not been conducted. The institutional appetite for examining a possible major submerged civilization site in the South China Sea has not materialized. The Sunda Shelf holds that distinction. The largest unsurveyed potential cultural site in human prehistory, waiting beneath water shallow enough to dive. The cultures surrounding it have been saying something was there for 10,000 years. The genetics suggest a dispersal event from that region precisely when it was going under. The seafloor is available. The equipment exists. Nobody has looked. Whatever is down there is still down there. 150 to 200 feet of water. 65,000 years of civilization, or the absence of one. The question is answerable. It has simply not been answered. Oppenheimer's evidence is in the blood, in population genetics, that point at a missing land. In Wales, the evidence is in the sand, and you can see it at low tide on any calm morning when the storms have done their work. Number 7. Cantre'r Gwaelod. The year is 2014. You're walking along Borth Beach on the west coast of Wales, in Cardigan Bay. After a series of severe winter storms have stripped away decades of covering sand, the intertidal zone has exposed something that has been waiting beneath the surface for 4,000 years. An entire forest. Ancient tree stumps, blackened but intact, still rooted in the dark peat in the positions they occupied when they were alive. Oak, pine, birch, alder, hazel woodland species that cannot grow on tidal mudflats. They grew on dry land. The land they grew on is now the floor of Cardigan Bay, and you are standing at the edge of it, looking at trees that watch the ocean come. The Welsh call this place Cantre'r Gwaelod, the Lowland 100. The legend is detailed and internally consistent. Cantre'r Gwaelod was a prosperous territory of 16 fortified towns, lying west of the current Welsh coast across land now beneath the bay. It was protected from the ocean by a system of embankments and sluice gates called Sarn Badrig. The man responsible for maintaining the gates was a keeper named Seithanin. He was a drunkard. One night, drunk at a feast while the tide was high, he left the gates unattended. The water found its way through. 16 towns. The bells of the drowned churches, the tradition says, can still be heard on certain evenings when the sea is very calm. Sarn Badrig is real. It is a rock causeway extending approximately 11 miles into Cardigan Bay at low tide, charted on current nautical maps. Welsh antiquarians have argued for centuries whether it represents a natural reef or the remains of the ancient seawall. The geological consensus is natural reef, but the consensus was formed before the peat analysis was completed. The Borth Forest has been carbon dated to between 2000 and 4000 BCE. The species identification is confirmed. These are not coastal plants. They are woodland species requiring sustained freshwater conditions and stable dry ground. Below the bay's floor, sediment cores contain peat layers with plant material consistent with Bronze Age human-managed landscapes, evidence of cleared fields, maintained hedgerows, the soil signatures of sustained agricultural civilization. There were fields here, there were paths, there were people, farming land that is now under an Irish Sea bay. The legend's insistence on a specific mechanism gates, a keeper, a single night, is the detail that stays in the memory across centuries. People do not preserve the bureaucratic minutiae of slow erosion. They do not name the man who fell asleep while the tide came in over 3 generations. They name the catastrophe and the failure that let it through, because the catastrophe happened fast enough to have a name. The core samples from the bay floor hold the evidence of how fast it actually happened. In at least 2 sediment cores recovered from Cardigan Bay, the transition from terrestrial peat to marine sediment is abrupt, not a gradual mixing of terrestrial and marine materials, which you would expect from slow inundation over centuries. Abrupt. The peat ends and marine sediment begins at a clear stratigraphic boundary. That is the signature of rapid flooding, not slow rise. A candidate event exists. The Storegga Slide, approximately 8,150 years ago, was one of the largest submarine landslides in geological history. A section of the Norwegian continental shelf, roughly the size of Iceland, detached and collapsed into the Atlantic in a single event. The resulting tsunami reached the coasts of Scotland, northern England, and Norway with waves estimated at 60 to 70 feet. The event is confirmed in sediment cores across multiple countries, a distinct sand layer deposited far above normal high tide zones in a single catastrophic episode. The Atlantic coastline of Wales was not sheltered from Atlantic origin wave events. A major pulse on the western Welsh coast, at any point when Cardigan Bay was still populated, would produce exactly the abrupt peat to marine transition the cores are showing. The Storega slide provides the mechanism. The Borth forest provides the land. The abrupt core transition provides the argument for speed. The tradition of Cantre'r Gwaelod provides what the speed felt like to the people it happened to. The ocean came because the ocean comes. The keeper failed because someone always fails when the ocean decides it is coming. And the bells of the churches that went under are still ringing, somewhere in the sediment of Cardigan Bay, on calm evenings, if you know where to listen. The peat cores show what happened in one Welsh bay. What the North Sea trawlers are pulling up shows what happened on a scale that dwarfs it. Number 8. Doggerland. The year is 1931. You're a crew member on the trawler Calinda, working the North Sea, approximately 25 miles off the coast of Norfolk, England. Your nets snag on something at the bottom. When you haul them up, tangled in the catch is a mass of dense black peat, ancient and reeking of deep earth. You pull it apart. Inside, intact and perfectly preserved, is a harpoon. Bone, barbed on one side, made by human hands. You are 25 miles out to sea, and someone carved this object on dry land. The harpoon is dated. Between 9 and 10,000 years old. The North Sea was land when it was made. Trawlers working these waters had been pulling up bones for years before the Calinda's crew found the harpoon. Mammoth teeth, woolly rhinoceros remains, the skulls of giant elk with antlers spanning 10 feet across, cave lion bones. The fishermen of the Norfolk coast sold the mammoth teeth as curiosities and told anyone who asked that there used to be a land out there under the water. The scientists eventually caught up. They named it Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank, the shallowest section of the North Sea floor where the bones came from most frequently. At its Ice Age maximum, Doggerland was not a coastal margin. It was a continent, 100,000 square miles connecting the British Isles to what is now Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands in a single continuous landmass. The ancestral Rhine cut through its center, fed by rivers from the British Highlands and the European interior. The landscape included marshlands, lakes, coastal wetlands, and vast forested plains. Ecologically, it resembled the most productive Mesolithic environments in the world, dense in migratory animals, rich in fish and waterfowl, the kind of land that supported the highest human population densities of the late Ice Age wherever it appeared. The harpoon the Calinda pulled up is not the record of a civilization in retreat. It is the record of a civilization at its height. Bone-barbed harpoons of this type were precision tools made from carefully selected bone, barbed for fish retention, shaped by someone who had done it many times. The man or woman who carved it lived on a continent with everything the late Mesolithic world could offer. They were not refugees. They were home. People lived there for thousands of years. The artifact record recovered by trawlers and documented by underwater archaeologists is extensive. Stone tools, bone implements, antler weapons, worked antler, plant remains. The assemblages are consistent with a sophisticated Mesolithic population, not wandering bands but settled communities with ritual life, long-distance trade networks, and the social organization that produces rich artifact deposits. They buried their dead with ceremony. They were not primitive. They were the peak of a cultural tradition that had been developing for 8,000 years. The Storega slide ended it. In approximately 6,200 BCE, a section of the Norwegian continental shelf the size of Iceland collapsed into the Atlantic in a single geological event. The resulting tsunami struck the coasts of Scotland, northern England, and Norway with waves estimated at 30 to 40 feet. The event is documented in sediment records across 4 countries, a distinct layer of sand deposited far above normal high tide levels in a single episode, found in coastal cores from the Shetland Islands to the Norwegian coast. Confirmed, not disputed. In 6,200 BCE, Doggerland was already much reduced from its Ice Age maximum. But the Dogger Bank itself, the shallow central ridge, still above water remained. People were still there. Research teams from the University of Bradford and the National Oceanography Center in Southampton modeled the tsunami's impact on the remaining above-water Doggerland. The modeling suggests the final above-water portions of the Dogger Bank were inundated within hours of the wave's arrival. Not over generations. Hours. The people on the bank had no warning. The Norse mythological tradition has a concept called Ragnarok. The world is flooded, swallowed by the Midgard serpent, land consumed by ocean, then resurfaces. Scholars read this as a cosmological metaphor for cyclic time. The Norse people are the descendants of communities that lived along the edge of the North Sea basin for 10,000 years and watched the world go under piece by piece. What looks like cosmological metaphor from inside a library looks like geological memory from the edge of a disappearing coast. The Kalinda's harpoon is held at Norwich Castle Museum. The date is confirmed. 9 to 10,000 years old. Made on dry land. Found under the sea. The person who carved it lived on a continent that no longer exists, and when the wave came, there was nowhere to run. The North Sea has been pulling up the bones of Doggerland for a century. On the other side of the world, an ocean 3 times larger holds a continent that 40 independent Polynesian kana. Traditions have been describing for thousands of years a homeland of 64 million people, somewhere beneath the Pacific, named in 1926 by a British Army officer who said he read about it on clay tablets in a monastery in Calcutta. Number 9. Mu. The year is 1882. You're in Calcutta, and you are James Churchward, a British Army officer and amateur scholar who has spent years developing a friendship with an elderly temple priest who guards a set of ancient clay tablets in a Hindu monastery. The priest has never shown the tablets to anyone outside the temple. Today, he shows them to you. The script on the tablets is unlike any writing system you have encountered. The priest calls it Knuckle. He reads them to you. What they describe is a continent in the Pacific Ocean, the motherland. It is 5,000 miles long. Its civilization is 12,000 years old. 64 million people live there. It is gone. The ocean took it. Churchward spends the next 40 years trying to tell the world. He publishes The Lost Continent of Mu, the motherland of man, in 1926. He is 75 years old. He has been carrying this since the monastery in Calcutta. The tablets he describes have never been independently located. But the traditions he was chasing had been kept alive for thousands of years before he arrived in India, by people who had never heard of the Knuckle and did not need ancient clay to remember what the ocean had taken. The Rapa Nui of Easter Island call it Hiva, the homeland, the place their ancestors came from before there were islands to settle, when the ocean was still being defined. Hiva was vast, and it was in the west, and the water came and took it. The survivors scattered to whatever high points remained. Easter Island is one of the most isolated inhabited specks on the planet, 2,300 miles from South America, 2,000 miles from the nearest inhabited island. The people who settled it were not wandering. They were running. They were carrying the memory of a world that had gone under, and they stopped when there was nowhere further to go. The Hawaiian tradition names a hidden land called Kanehunomokutha land, hidden by Kane, the creator god, not destroyed. Hidden, somewhere in the ocean, preserved beneath the surface, waiting to be recovered. The structure of the tradition is identical to the Maori account of Te Rioea Maui. The land is there, it went down, and the ocean holds it still. 40 distinct Polynesian traditions across the Pacific and Hawaiian, Maori, Samoan, Tongan, Marquesan, Rapa Nui share the core structure. There was land here once, and the water came, and the people who escaped remember where they came from. The geology supports what the traditions encode. Across the central Pacific, the ocean floor is studded with Guyot's flat-topped seamounts, mountains whose peaks were planed flat by wave action when they were above the surface. They are now underwater. They were once islands, and the flat tops confirm they stood at sea level long enough for the ocean to shave them. The Pacific Plate has been moving northwest for millions of years, carrying the remnants of what it held deeper and further from the light. Whatever land existed in the Central Pacific at the peak of Ice Age sea level drops was genuinely larger, genuinely higher, genuinely above water. The Pacific was not always as empty as a current map suggests. The genetic and linguistic dispersal of Polynesian populations tells a story consistent with rapid, spread from a central collapsing source rather than a slow incremental island-hopping migration. Polynesians carry a genetic signature of a founding population that underwent a sharp, sudden, severe reduction in numbers at approximately the period when Pacific sea levels were undergoing their most rapid, post-glacial rise. A population bottleneck of that type is the genetic signature of catastrophe, not exploration, not gradual settlement. A people reduced to survivors, scattering outward, carrying everything they still had. The Marquesan word for their ancestral homeland is Havaki. The Samoan word is Savaki. The Maori word is Haweki. The Hawaiian name for their own island chain is Hawaii. These are not coincidences of linguistic drift. They are the same word carried across 6,000 miles of ocean in 4 different directions from the same starting point, preserved because the people who carried it needed to remember where they came from. The center those words point back to is not any island still above water. It is somewhere in the direction they all came from. It is where Mu was. Churchward's knuckle tablets may or may not still exist in a monastery in Calcutta. What exists beyond any doubt are the 40 traditions, the converging etymologies, and the flat-topped mountains under the Pacific that used to see the sky. The ocean holds Mu in 63 million square miles of water. The Bering Sea, on the northern edge of that same ocean, holds something smaller and more recent a continent that people watched go under not in mythological time, but in decades. Number 10. Beringia. The year is 1979. You're reading a paper by Canadian anthropologist Knut Fladmark, and it is quietly dismantling one of the foundational assumptions of American prehistory. The standard model says the first people reached the Americas by walking across a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age, then moving south through an ice-free corridor between 2 enormous glacial sheets. Fladmark says the corridor never opened early enough. The first Americans didn't walk through a glaciated interior. They paddled down the coast, and the coast they paddled is now under the Pacific Ocean. The land bridge has a name, Beringia, but at its Ice Age maximum, it was not a bridge. It was a continent, a landmass approximately 1,000 miles wide from north to south, covering what is now the Bering Sea and the Chukchi Sea and a single continuous territory larger than modern Alaska, not glaciated. The climate was cold and dry, but the ice sheets formed further east and south, leaving Beringia exposed as a vast open grassland, the Mammoth Steppe, supporting herds of woolly mammoth, bison, horse, and cave lion in concentrations that would have dwarfed anything in modern Africa. People who settled here had access to more protein per taya, per square mile than almost any other Ice Age environment on Earth. The genetic evidence tells us how long they stayed. Modern mitochondrial DNA analysis of Native American populations shows their ancestral lineage underwent a period of isolation from both Asian populations to Quad, the West, and American populations developing to the East, lasting between 15,000 and 20,000 years. During this period, the ancestral Native American population was evolving in a bounded territory, separate from everyone else on Earth. The only geography fitting that genetic signature is Beringia itself. The people who became the first Americans spent 20,000 years on a continent now 150 feet under the Bering Sea. 20,000 years. Longer than the entire span of recorded history. Sites in South America dated to 15,000 BCE. Thousands of years before the ice-free interior corridor could have opened can only be reached by people traveling the Pacific coastal route. What remains unresolved is what Beringian civilization looked like across those 20,000 years, and what it built that the ocean has not yet returned, because the inundation was not gradual in all of its phases. Between 13,000 and 10,000 BCE, the Bering Sea filled in pulses correlated with accelerating glacial collapse. The genetic record of Native American lineages shows population disruptions correlating precisely with major inundation events. The people living on the final above-water portions of Beringia had their world go under in episodes measured in decades, not centuries. The last above-water Beringian land disappeared approximately 10,000 years ago. The populations were driven east onto the North American continent and west back onto the Siberian mainland. Not nomads following herds, refugees running from water. The oral traditions of the Yupik peoples of Alaska and the Siberian coast are explicit about what was lost. A time when their ancestors walked across to the people on the other side. The land was there. Then the water came. The Siberian Yupiks say the same thing from the other shore. Two peoples, separated by an ocean, both encoding the same fact. There was land here once, and it was where our history begins. More than 300 distinct indigenous cultural traditions in the Americas contain flood narratives. 300. Across languages so structurally different that literary borrowing is not a viable explanation for the convergence. Each tradition encodes its own version. The water rising, the land going under, the survivors carrying the memory forward. 300 peoples. 300 versions of what it felt like when the continent their ancestors lived on went under the ocean. The floor of the Bering Sea is 150 feet deep over the former Beringian plain. It has not been systematically surveyed for human archaeological sites. 20,000 years of civilization on a continent the size of Australia, and no one has looked. Whatever Beringia held is under that water, under 10,000 years of sediment, pressing the weight of everything it was against a cold and unexamined floor. 10 continents. 10 times the ocean arrived and took the land. The survivors ran to high ground and told their children what the water had taken. We are their children's children. We are on land that is above the water right now, under a sky that does not announce what it has planned. Subscribe and turn on notifications if this is a conversation you want to continue. If this one reached something in you, leave a like. And drop a comment with where you're watching from. Every time I read those locations, I think about the people who once lived on whatever land is now under the water beneath your feet. You might be further from the original shore than you know.